So today we are going to be learning about the context API. So let's pause for a second and take a look at this entire week. This sprint is all about state management, different ways that you can manage your state outside of just local component state and passing data via props. The reducer pattern using the use reducer hook allows us to manage state with reducers without bringing in the all the extra boilerplate code of Redux. So we get the use of reducers to manage state as our apps start to grow and scale. We still, with the reducer pattern, we still use props. We're passing props from wherever the reducer hook is called, where the state is being managed, down to children components. Then we have Redux, a large complex library that helps us manage state outside of React. So there's one store, one place to manage all of your state for your application, other than, of course, like form state or other single component specific state. Now there are other libraries like Redux. Then we learned Redux Thunks, and there's other middleware libraries that you can use with Redux to manage asynchronous operations in Redux. One other popular one is Redux Sagas. So that would be good to take a look at if you like Redux and if you want to see another async Redux flow. One other advantage that we didn't really talk about with Redux is that it allows you to not have to pass props from parent to child down 4 or 5 levels in your component tree. So that's kind of nice. Any component that needs any state in the Redux store, you simply connect that component and you have access to all the state that is in the Redux store. Finally, we're going to talk about Context API, which also helps us to avoid that prop drilling, managing a piece of state in some ancestor component and passing that state down 4 or 5 levels or 10 levels or 12 levels to where that data is actually needed. So that's what we call prop drilling. We're going to learn how we can, let me bring my annotation up here. We're going to learn how we can manage state in some parent component. And then below this, in the component tree somewhere way down below, let's say we have state X, and it needs to be rendered down here in this component. Instead of passing props through many intermediary components that don't ever use this state, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap all of this inside a context, using context. We're going to pass this state to the context provider, and anywhere now within this component tree, we can consume that data using the context API. So you can skip out on all of this. We can take away these. Goodbye, goodbye. Woo! We just pass our state to the context provider, and anywhere inside that component tree now, you can consume that state using the context API. So let's take a look at context then. We're going to talk about, we kind of just described what the context API is and the problem it solves. So the big problem that it solves is prop drilling. However, there's another kind of situation as well that we want to look at. So let's bring our component tree back up here. And let's say we've got a component tree that looks like this. Da, da, da. Okay, just use your imagination here. Bear with me. Okay, so here's our component tree. We want our state to be, so let's say we've got some state that we're managing here. We want, and we need to render that state in a lot of different places throughout this component tree, like so. We can wrap the entire component tree. We'll move that, hold on one second. Get it wrapped around everything. There we go. We can wrap our entire component tree inside a context provider. And now any of these components that need to render that state, we don't have to pass props all over this component tree. So two reasons we might use context. One is to avoid prop drilling, and the other is to provide data to a large component tree that needs to display that state in a lot of different places. So those are kind of the two purposes that we might use context. However, there is a big gotcha with context. So let me open this up. And I'm going to go to the context docs. Oh, that's not it. There we go. Okay, so here's the context docs. And we're going to go to where it says before you use context. Context is primarily used when some data needs to be accessible by many components at many different nesting levels. But the React team has said apply it sparingly because it makes component reuse more difficult. So one big thing that you've learned about React is that you can make components reusable. However, if you use context API, it makes component reuse more difficult. So we want to be careful about choosing when to use the context API. We'll come back to this a little bit later, and I'll show you, once we understand context and can see how it works, then we'll understand why this happens. If you only want to avoid passing some props through many levels, then there's another pattern called component composition. That's often a more simple solution. So let me post these. For you. I'm gonna find our Slack channel. All right. So here are the context API docs. Here is another pattern that we're not going to learn here at Lambda School, but it is a cool pattern that you can explore if you are so inclined. Okay, so that is the context API and the reasons we might use the context API. So, oh, sorry, let me. Okay, so let's talk about how we can provide data to the component tree with a context provider. So we're going to come down to this objective. And in order to provide data to component tree, we need to set up a context object. So let's open up the code sandbox for today. And you can see that we've already got a fully working app. I'm going to open this up in a new window, and let's explore this application using the React DevTools. All right, so here is a representation of our component tree. We've got our application, or our app component, that is the main parent for this entire application. Then we have a single child component called family tree. Family tree has two children components, one called parents and one called siblings. So if we were to draw this out, we would have app, then we would have family tree, then we would have parents and siblings. And right now, the state for our data is being managed inside our app. We'll just call this family. And it's passed down to family tree. And then family tree passes it down to both children components here. So what we're going to learn to do today is we're going to do this 3 different ways. We're going to manage our state 3 different ways. We are going to take away this prop passing here. And we're going to consume data. This is going to consume via context. We're going to do this with the render prop pattern. This component down here, we're still going to pass props. So we're going to keep our old pattern, what we've learned already with props and state. We're going to pass props from this component down to our parents. But our sibling component is going to consume data. We're going to use context. And this is going to use the context hook. Use context. All right, so since we have these two, the state is being managed here. Let me go one more different color here. Yellow. Yellow will look good with this. All right, since we have state being managed here, and we've got this component and this component are going to be using the context API to consume that data. That means we need to wrap this whole tree in our context provider. So that's the plan for today. All right, we'll come back to this drawing. We understand how this app is working a little bit better now. Let's go ahead and create our context object so that we can wrap our application, our component tree, inside that context object, inside the context provider. So This is usually done in a separate file. Let's do this right here inside our app component, inside our app.js file, and then we'll move it out into its own file when we're done. Okay, so our app component is using the useState hook to manage state for our families. Our families are coming from this data point here. So data.js is just an array of our 3 families, singing families. So we've got families. Then there's an active family, which is chosen by clicking on these buttons here. When we click on Osmonds, then it sets the Osmonds object to the active family state. When we click on Jackson 5, now they are the active family. Okay, and then remember the child component of app is family tree. So you can see that family tree is being rendered here, and we're passing the active family down to that component as a prop. So our goal is to remove that prop and provide that data to family tree through context. So let's set up our context object, and I'm going to close this now. And let's go ahead and open, we don't need data. Let's get our children components out here. All right, so we've got our app component on the left and our family tree component on the right. So we want to set up a context object. Now, the data that this context object is going to be managing or help managing is family data, right? Our active family from our families array. So I'm going to call this family context. Sometimes you'll see people shorten this to, I think it's CTX is the kind of the common way to spell it. So family context equals, now we need to bring in a create context function from React. So if you didn't get that auto import, then jump up to the top and import create context from React. Okay, we're going to call that function. And this now creates a context object for us. So go ahead and get that set up. Import create context. Set up your family context object. Then we're going to console log family context and see what is created here. All right, console.log family context. Now let's open up our app, and we'll go to the console. And above all the errors, we should see that context object console right here. Let me show you a little trick to console logging if you haven't learned this yet. Sometimes you have a lot of console logs, right? You're trying to debug something and you've got a lot of console logs happening, and it's hard to come over here. It just makes it a little more tedious to come look at which file and which line you're console logging from to know where that console log is coming from. So if you're console logging a variable, if you just throw curly braces around that inside your console log, it will create an object with a property called family context in your console log, and then the value of that variable. So let's take a look at the first one. Oh, so here we go. Look how much easier that is to see what we're console logging. Way better. So look at that compared to without those curly braces. You really don't know what this is, especially if there's tons and tons of console logs happening. So again, if you're console logging a variable, just throw curly braces around it, and it gives you this nice named console log. And now click into here, and this is your data. Okay, so family context. This is an object, as we can see here. So family context is an object, and there's a few weird properties with these underlines, these underscores. Usually in programming, when you see this, this is something that happens more with object-oriented languages like Java or C#, or I think Python does this too. But seeing this underline means that this is a private method. So these should not be used outside of where this function is defined. So first thing I notice when I'm looking at this is I should not be using any of these in any of my code. Also, whenever I see weird symbols like this, I know that that's probably just also an internal thing for the library, so I'm not worried about this. So then I come to the last two properties on this object, provider and consumer. So the context object, when we call create context, calling create context creates a provider and a consumer. Now it's another thing that I noticed here is that both provider and consumer are capitalized. And that's not a normal thing to do in JavaScript, right? Usually we have camel casing, and a variable name or a property will start lowercase and then be camel cased beyond that. So let me ask you this question. What in React uses I can't spell capitalized letters or words? Oh, yes, action types do. Good point. Classes, sometimes. Oh, yeah, our components. But we capitalize our components because we want to render them in JSX. So yes, components. Exactly. So looking at this, I can already assume that provider and consumer are both components. There's nothing really inside here that would help me figure that out other than the casing. Okay, so provider and consumer must be components, I think. All right, final thing before we take a break, do questions and take a break. We're going to use the provider component that family context is giving us to wrap our component tree. So we need to make sure that, so well, this provider is going to be rendered where our state is managed. And these components down here are the components that need to be nested inside our provider component. So our state is managed in app. So we're going to render the provider inside our app component, and it's going to wrap family tree. Now, siblings is a child of family tree, right? So we won't see this in our app file. So we just need to make sure that we wrap family tree inside this provider component. So let me bring the app component back up. Family tree is right here. So we have a decision to make. We can simply wrap our provider around the family tree right here. We can do it around this entire block. We could even do it around all of this inside our, or we could do it around all of this inside our div. We could wrap this outside of our div. It's kind of up to you. Whatever, all of those places would work because family tree would be wrapped inside our provider component. So whatever makes sense to you, whatever, there's really no difference in any of those other than aesthetics looking at the code. When you look at this code, how do you want to, where would you want to see that? For me, personally, this section right here doesn't have anything to do with the context object because we just need to provide active family, right? So for me, I'm going to wrap it around this expression right here. All right, so how do we get our provider? We have family context dot provider. So there's two ways to do this. We can say family context dot provider. This is going to be kind of an issue here. Family context is not capitalized. So when this JSX is rendered as HTML, this will, the Webpack will look at this, Babel will look at this and say, all right, I'm gonna find an HTML element called family context. Well, there's no such thing as family context in HTML, right? So context objects, when created, are usually capitalized like this. Just for the simple fact that we can, just so we can render that context object in JSX. Okay, now we need to close that component. And now our family tree has been wrapped inside our provider. The other way to do this is to pull out the provider itself from that object and then just render this as provider. So however you want to do that is up to you. I've seen both patterns quite often, so I don't know that there's a industry-wide way of doing this. I'm just going to keep it like this so that we know that it's coming from our family context. We're going to be very explicit here, family context dot provider. Okay, so let's pause here. We're not quite done with provider, but we're going to pause for questions and then a break. So let me add 1 minute to our timer and we will take questions. All right, we've got 1 question so far. Oh, why did I do that? Did not mean to do that. Oh, there's another question. Good. That's what I meant to do. Okay, general question. I know adding the curly brace over highlighted text adds curly braces around them, but how did you get spaces on both ends as well? That comes from Prettier. So you can define rules like that, like there's supposed to be spaces inside your curly braces using your Prettier config. If I were to look at my settings, now Code Sandbox uses Visual Studio Code. It's basically Visual Studio embedded inside your browser, which is really cool. So if we look at Prettier, we can see that the default formatter for our styles is Prettier. And workspace settings. Okay, so right here, it doesn't let us use or set up those different rules, but using Prettier for our default formatter, it gives us that when I save the file, then it prettifies the syntax for me. Okay, good question. Get out of here, Zoom tools. All right, so is this doing what Redux does? In a sense, just making it easier to pass our state through our props, just a different way of doing so. Redux uses context under the hood. So yes, this is doing exactly what Redux does. In fact, after you wrap your provider around the app component and then inspect that your project using the Redux dev tools, you'll notice that there's the provider component that you wrapped, and then inside, nested just inside of that, before you get to your app component, it says something like Redux context. It says something about context in there. So yeah, Redux uses context to allow you to retrieve data at any point in your application. That's how it passes data down without props. Being able to solve the same problem, what would be the incentive to use Redux versus context? Context seems easier, faster setup. Yes, it absolutely is. Redux is basically, among other things, the way it shares data through the whole app is by wrapping the entire application in a single context provider. So you could do the same. You could have your application managed state and wrap it inside the entire context, and wrap the entire application inside one context provider. But then your app component would be managing all of your state for the entire application. And that's generally not a good thing to do. Redux removes the state management away from your app component and into its own Redux store. So it just depends. Context, in my opinion, is less of a global state management solution and more specific to component trees, isolated component trees. You can combine the context API with the use reducer hook and make a really cool state management system. I'll show you that towards the end if we have a little time. All right, let's go ahead and take a break. I'll see you back in 5. Okay, come back to your computers. Henry, that looks like the river by where I grew up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Coeur d'Alene River. Great fishing right there. All right. I've got a short quiz for you. So everybody jump to Slido and get ready. Remember as we learned yesterday, the leaderboard goes off of accuracy and time. So get ready. Here we go. Oh, let me pull it up from here. And here's the quiz. So join the quiz and then I will start the quiz. Okay, starting the quiz in 3, 2, 1. What two components are available to you when you create a context object? I'm going to enable timers here. So you're going to have 20 seconds on each question. The next two questions. Okay, moving on. Let's see the results. 3, 2, 1. Oh, good. We got 80. Okay. Phew. All right. So here's the results. The correct answer is provider and consumer. I got you with the CON on context here. So the two components that a context object has are provider and consumer. All right, next question. This time you're going to have 20 seconds. So here we go. Five seconds left. 3, 2, 1. Time's up. Okay, so the correct answer here is it makes component reuse harder. So why do we want to use the context API sparingly? Not because it's too easy, not because there's too much code. It actually makes sharing data easier between components, but it does make component reuse harder. All right, final question. Does Redux use the context API under the hood? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, the correct answer is yes, it does. Redux does use the context API. Okay, let's check out the leaderboard. Congratulations to Jesus, number 1. Vic, Gabby, Chad, and Rodrigo. You each get 20 points for your Hogwarts house of choice. Well done. All right, that's fun. I like that quiz thing. I'm going to do that more often. That's a beta feature with Slido, so hopefully they don't take that away because I enjoy that. Okay, so we have created a context object. We've explored what that context object is and found that it has a provider and consumer component. So we can take away we think because we now know that those are components. And we are wrapping our provider around the component tree that we want to provide data to which we want to provide data. There, any English buffs out there? I caught myself. Phew, that was a close one. So the next thing we need to do is actually provide data to this component tree. And the way we do that is passing down a value prop to the context provider. Now this value prop can be anything. It can be an array, it can be an object, it can be a string, it can be a number. Any single piece of data can be passed to this value prop. So what if we have a component that has many pieces of data? What if we've got 5 state properties that we want to pass down to this provider? Well, we've got 2 pieces of state here. We've got families and active family, right? We only want to pass down active family. So we're going to end up doing this, pass down active family. But what if we wanted to pass down families as well? We would make an object and pass down each state property that needs to be provided to this component tree. So you can see how getting used to this shorthand object syntax that we're using up here, we're using down here, we use in the connect function yesterday and the day before. Getting used to that is a really handy tool. Otherwise, we'd have to say families equals families, and active family equals active family, and we'd have to set it up like that. Much easier to use the shorthand, object shorthand. Okay, so we don't need families. We just want active families. So let's go ahead and remove this object like so. Active family. So we're going to pass the active family object down to, or we're going to provide the active family object to our component tree. So let's go to family tree. We're no longer passing props down to family tree. That's why we're getting this error. We don't have props.family on this in this component anymore. Remember, the old setup was this was taking in a family prop, and we were passing the active family down as a prop. So let's go look at this component. We're going to look at the prop that we're passing down, and we're going to look at our provider and see if we can use our context provider to grab this via context rather than props. All right, I'm going to refresh the page. Let's go to our React Dev Tools. Okay, so here's family tree. Family tree is getting a family prop, which is an object with a family name, an array of parents, an array, and an array of siblings. So now let's look at our context provider here. So our context provider, hey, look at that. It has the same object being passed to the value. So let's go to our family tree. We're going to take away the props. Let's go to our family tree and let's consume data from the context object. Rather than from props. Okay, so I can actually take away props here like that and take away any reference to props in my component. So now what I'm missing is an object called family. So we're going to do this the hard way first. We're going to use the render prop pattern. Yeah, render props pattern. And in order to do this, we need to import the consumer component. And we're going to wrap the consumer component around our JSX that needs the data. Whew, okay. So this H1 needs our data all the way down to our siblings component. So we're going to wrap all of this inside our consumer component. So let's take our family. I think this is a good point to break our context object out into its own file now that we need it in a new file here. So in my source folder, I'm going to create a new folder called contexts, in case you have multiple. And let's do an index.js file. And I'm just going to take all of this out of my app file and put it into this index.js. And of course, we need to import create context from React. All right, so go ahead and get that set up in your app. Remove those 4 lines of code out of your app component and into this index file. And the index.js file is inside contexts folder. All right, now I'm gonna move this over here and split it down. Okay, bring up my app component. Okay, so I've got my context being created here. So I'm getting an error now because I no longer have my family context object in my app file. So let's import. Ooh, we need to export it from this file here. Export const family context. So let's import family context from dot slash contexts. Remember, because we're using index.js for our ES6, using ES6 modules, we don't have to specify the file, we just say which folder we're importing from. Okay, so next, we've got our app component set back up. We can remove create context from app. Next, let's move to our family tree and import family context from / contexts. All right, so we have imported the consumer component. So next we're going to wrap the consumer component around our JSX that needs the data. So we're going to say family context dot consumer. And we're going to wrap it around all of this. What did I do? Okay. But we still have a problem. How do we get family out of here? Well, the render props pattern is the way that we used to do this. So this is the hard way to do this. I spilled some soda on my keyboard yesterday, and my space bar is sticky. It's the worst. All right, render props pattern. Blah, we don't like it, but I'm going to show you it anyways, so you can be prepared for it if you ever see it in the wild. Okay, so the render props pattern inside, let's move this up. Inside our consumer component, we need to evaluate some JavaScript. So we're going to use curly braces. We're going to evaluate a function. We're going to pass in a function here. Now this function, when React calls this function, it's going to pass in the value data that we passed in right here. So whatever we pass in here will be available to us here. So if you want, we could call this active family, or you can call it value, or hey, we could even name it family. That's what this JSX is expecting, right? So let's name this family. And I want you to just keep in mind that active family is family. Okay, so I'll keep that bridge there so we know that this family argument is our active family that we're trying to pass down. Okay, so now we need to, out of this function, we need to return some JSX. So whenever we return JSX, whether it's in a render prop or a dot map or from a component, it always has to have some wrapping element, right? So we can't just take all of this and put it into here because it says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So we have to have some kind of element that wraps all of this before we put it into here. The easiest way to do this is to use JSX, or I guess this would be called React fragments. So if you haven't seen a fragment yet, they're amazing. They are basically an empty element, JSX element, that gets stripped out before your JSX makes it into the DOM as HTML. Before fragments were a thing, we would just simply do a wrapping div. Like so. And this would all be nested there. And React developers, because of this, kind of got a bad rap for having just empty, nonsensical divs everywhere. So in order to save us a lot of headache with our CSS and with what our HTML output is, the React team gave us fragments. And a fragment is simply empty carrots like this. What this does is it gives us an element to wrap our JSX so we can return it out of a function or out of a component. But this gets stripped out when the HTML is created. So you won't ever see this in the HTML, in the DOM. Let's go ahead and move this up. See if I can get some fine control. There we go. Okay, so we'll save that. So the render prop pattern says that we wrap our consumer component around the JSX that needs to consume data from our provider. We use the curly braces because we need to add a function inside here. And then that function is going to be given whatever data we pass into the value prop over here. That's going to be the argument for our function. Then we simply just return our normal JSX. Now we can clean this up a little bit by doing an implicit return. So instead of saying return, we're just going to take away the curly braces, leave our parentheses, and that's a little bit cleaner. But look at how much is going on in this code. We don't like it. But let's see if this is working. Let's just make sure. Cool. Now here's the problem with the render prop. Render prop adds this consumer component inside our component tree here. The React team, when they built hooks, the very first piece of motivation that they had around building hooks was that it's hard to reuse stateful logic between components. And there were two patterns that had emerged to share stateful logic between components. First is render props, like we're seeing here, and the other is higher order components. The connect function is a higher order component. So hooks allow us to achieve this without using these complicated, gross patterns. I say gross now because we have hooks, but before hooks, these were amazing because they allowed us to do this. But with hooks, it's just so much better. If you look at a typical React application in React DevTools, you will likely find a wrapper hell of components surrounded by layers of providers, consumers. Hey, look at this. We have wrapper hell going on, providers and consumers everywhere. So the React team is telling us that this is a problem and there's a solution. React needs a better primitive for sharing stateful logic. So hooks is the solution. Hooks allow you to reuse stateful logic without changing your component hierarchy. We can achieve this same thing without wrapping a consumer component, an extra component, around our components. We don't have to change our component hierarchy if we use React hooks rather than the render prop pattern. So that's what we're going to do inside our siblings component. So our parents component is going to still receive props. Our siblings component, we're going to share data. We're going to pass data down as using the context API, but we're not going to consume data in siblings with this pattern. We're going to consume it with the consumer hook, which you'll see is 10 times better. All right, let's pause here for questions and a quick break. Okay, we've got some good questions. Can you explain what the double ampersand does? Active family and family tree. Yeah, so this is, I always forget the name. Okay, 30 points for anyone who can look this up and find the name for this. Basically what this does is, if you think about this inside an if statement, then it would look for this first JavaScript expression to be truthy before it moves on to this second JavaScript expression, right? So if we, let me go here, open up my console. So I'm going to say if 1 is greater than 0 and 1 is less than 2, console.log they are both truthy. Okay, so we see that console log happen, right? Because this evaluated to a truthy value, and this evaluated to a truthy value. Well, what if this is falsy here? So let's do this again. Let's do, what if this first one is falsy? What's going to happen? We don't see that console log. And the JavaScript engine just looked at this, and it didn't even have to evaluate this second expression, because the double ampersand is like a gatekeeper. If this first expression is not truthy, you don't ever get to this second expression. what if we did or? What's going to happen with or? This is going to be falsy, but JavaScript will look at this and say, well, that one's falsy, but let's check this one. If either of these are truthy, let's change this. At least one is truthy. Let's do that again, but this time let's make this one truthy. 1 is greater than 0. 1 is greater than 2. We still get this, but this time this JavaScript engine didn't have to move on to the second expression because this was truthy. So understanding those operators, let's look at it in context of this. So we've got curly braces in our JavaScript, in our JSX, which tells us that we're going to evaluate some JavaScript expression. So here's a JavaScript expression, and there's a double ampersand. So if this is a truthy value, then we move on past our double ampersand and evaluate this. So if we have something under active family, then go ahead and render family tree. This happens if you need to set some data somehow in an asynchronous way. So state and setting state is asynchronous. So if we don't have this, then we wouldn't, then that means if active family is null and we're trying to render family tree, then that means that family up here is going to be null or undefined. That means that we're going to get the error saying cannot read property family name of undefined. So this is basically just a gatekeeper to say, hey, if active family is ever undefined or null, if this ever comes back as a falsy value, don't move past my gatekeeper and don't evaluate this expression here. However, if this is an object, and objects are truthy values, if this is truthy, go ahead and move past here and render my family tree component. Long-winded answer, but hopefully that helps you understand that better. If you have multiple states being passed as the value in provider, can you still rename it like we renamed it? Yeah, so let's do this. Let's surround this with an object and let's pass in families as well. Now, family here is this entire object. So we no longer have family.family name because family name is nested inside here. So we'd have to say family.activeFamily.family name. So all you're doing by passing multiple values here is changing the shape of the data that's being passed to the provider, which means the shape of your data for your consumer is being changed. So then you have to change everything that everywhere you're referencing family, you have to change that to family.activeFamily. Okay, last question. So with Redux, what would be the equivalent to the consumer? Would it be the connect function? Just trying to understand a bit more. Yes, inside the connect function, Redux is using the consumer. I think they're actually now using the use context hook to consume data from the provider. So that's how inside the connect function, I believe that is how it works. If you're using Redux hooks and you're using the use selector hook, then it's going to also use under the hood, it's going to also use the consumer. All right, let's take a break, and I'll see you back in 5. Alrighty, come on back to your computers. Okay, we're going to finish up. What we're going to do, again, we're going to keep this pattern here, our props pattern here, just so you can see that you can intermix all of these different things. Just because you choose one solution doesn't mean you can't have props somewhere else or context. If you have Redux, you can still use the context API. All of these are interchangeable, intermixable. So there's props being passed down to the parent. Now let's go into the siblings component. And here we're going to use the context hook. So I'm just going to highlight all of this so I don't have to type it out. Again, let's bring siblings over here. Okay, so consume data from the context object rather than from props. And this time we're going to use the context hook pattern. That means we have a very, stop. No, this is the worst ever. Stay. Dang it. Why? Okay, I have an idea. This is a very happy pattern. There we go. Oh man. All right, so for this, we don't need the consumer component, but we do need the context object. And instead of wrapping the consumer component around our JSX and using the very confusing render prop pattern, we're simply going to call the context hook and pass in the context object. And that will return the value of whatever we've passed in. So let me show you how this works. We're trying to get to our siblings array. So we're going to import the use context hook. We're going to import family context object. Like that. So go ahead and get those two imports in. Now we're going to say that our family, so remember, when we call the context hook and pass in our context object, we get this whole object out here. So let's just call this family. Const family equals use context. We pass in family context. So let's console log family. I'm going to wrap it inside an object so we can see it. It'll be named family in our console log. So if we scroll up above there, okay, there's our family object. See, look how nice that is. There's our full family context object. There's our family object. All right, so family, we're looking for the array of siblings. So we need to say family.siblings is the data we're looking for. So here, where we're saying props.siblings.map, we're no longer getting data from props. We're now getting it from this family object. So we're going to say family.siblings.map. Okay, let's go see if that worked. Hooray! It's working. It's working. We did it. All right. Look how much easier that is. I'm going to erase this. This versus this. Right? Do you see why this is a happy face? And this is a very sad face. Render props are no fun. You may see render props somewhere in the wild. You may be hired somewhere that they don't have hooks yet. I hope that's not the case, but there are lots of really large enterprise corporations out there that are still using like 16.2, React version 16.2 without hooks. So if that's the case and they are using context, then you'll have to work with this pattern here. If you have access to hooks, hopefully you have access to hooks, then this is the pattern that you'll be following. I do want to also take a look here at our components. Notice how family tree has a nested consumer component, but siblings does not. We can go to the siblings component, look at the use context hook, and we can see that it's getting past that active family object. So we can still explore what the value is from context. With parents, you can't do that. We can't see the value here. So with the parent or with family tree, we don't see the context value. You have to go into consumer, and that's where you can see the value. So again, just one more plug for hooks that it makes it a lot easier, even in the dev tools, to use. All right, that is everything. I'm going to see if there's any other questions, and then I have kind of a fun project for you to work on for the rest of lecture time. So let's put 1 minute up for questions, and I am going to go grab that project. Okay, here's the project. It's a fun one. It's a matching game. Yay, we scored. Okay, let's see if there's any questions that have come in. Nope, no questions. So I'm going to fork this. I'm going to pass this to you. Oh, logical and. Thank you, Rochelle. You win. Logical and operator. Well, that's what the double is called. I think there's a specific name for JSX. I'll look it up. Okay. Here is the match project, the match app. And this is what you'll be doing for the next 25 minutes. And then you can come back to this as a stretch if you want at the end of the day. So just get as far as you can in the next 25 minutes. When you're done, pass or DM your link to your TL so that they know you were working during that 25 minutes. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to put all of this state onto a context object, or you can even create 2 different context objects, one for your scoreboard and one for your playboard. Then for each component, you're going to pass data down via prop or via context rather than props. So what this will look like at the end is something like this, and then something like scoreboard context dot provider. And then have a playing board provider, and then your value are the props that used to be passed into here. So that is your goal for this. Yeah, so that is it for today. Remember, when on the hour, I'll ping the channel to remind you to send your link to your TL, but just get as far as you can. This isn't, just show your TL that you've been working on it. You don't have to get to any specific point. Just build out context objects, pass these state properties through context rather than through prompts. All right, have fun, and I will see you all tomorrow.